Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in educational settings. Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I am a senior lecturer at Bath Spa University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, and an independent writer and speaker for critical early years. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting oracy in primary and early years settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to introduce Amy Gaunt as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, Amy. How are you?
Hi, Shaddai. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. And before we get started, perhaps you could just give a short introduction to yourself for our listeners.
Yes, so I am Director of Learning, Impact and Influence at Voice 21. Voice 21 is the national oracy education charity, so we support schools to embed high quality oracy education. We work with about 1,200 schools across the UK. We've been around for 10 years. Before joining Voice 21, about 8 years ago, I was a primary school teacher focusing on leading oracy across a primary school in East London. I've taught in London and internationally as well.
Brilliant. So in this episode, we're building on from the broad understanding of oracy and its importance in the first episode, and going to be thinking more practically about what teachers can do to support oracy in their classrooms. So, Amy, for a teacher listening to this, thinking about oracy, what are the sorts of things that they should be keeping in mind as they begin to develop this more in their practice?
So, about 7 or 8 years ago, when we first started to kind of, as Voice 21, to go out into schools and talk about oracy, this was a question that we got a lot. Mm-hmm. So we developed something called the oracy benchmarks. And the oracy benchmarks essentially sort of codify what we mean by high quality oracy education. And we've got a set of oracy teacher benchmarks and a set of oracy school benchmarks to recognise the fact that teachers who are in the classroom every day and leaders have sort of different levers to be able to pull to prioritise oracy within their remit, I guess. So I think maybe for this question, it'd be useful to go through the teacher oracy benchmarks and give you some examples of how teachers might enact those within their classroom. So the first one is sets high expectations for oracy. Now, this isn't about saying that every child needs to be speaking in, standard English, full sentences all the time. What we mean by sets high expectations for oracy is firstly that you have expectations for oracy. So what we found when we first started going to schools and talking to them about oracy was that they had really sort of high expectations for students' writing, for behaviour, for all those sorts of things. But when you ask them, what are your expectations around oracy, they didn't actually sort of have any expectations. So the first thing around setting high expectations is just having them around oracy, about thinking, what would really effective talk look like in this context? What am I expecting from this talk task? How can I make sure that I'm sharing those expectations with students so that they're able to meet those expectations? What scaffolding or support might I need to provide students with to be able to meet my expectations for oracy? And it's also about being really ambitious for your students. So not saying, do you know what, my students aren't going to be able to engage in a sort of extended discussion. It's thinking, actually, yes, if I teach them the skills to be able to do that, if I provide them with really great stimulus for talk and teach them how to engage in that, they are going to be able to have a really brilliant discussion that's going to take forward their learning. So it's about having high expectations for what students can achieve in oracy and making sure that you're communicating those to your students. The next one is values every voice. So this is about making sure that every child is included within opportunities for oracy within the classroom. So making sure that you're thinking about how to involve all children. So children that might have speech, language and communication needs, who have SEND, making sure you're thinking about how to sort of deliberately involve those children within the classroom. It's also about making sure that you're valuing different sort of accents, dialects within the classroom, that you don't have one sort of set idea of what talk should look like, that you're really sort of broadening it out, making sure that all children's voices are welcome within the classrooms. That's a really, really important one. The third benchmark is teaches oracy explicitly. So this is not just kind of having those high expectations, creating those opportunities for students to engage in talk, but actually making sure that you're really sort of deliberately and explicitly teaching children the oracy skills they need to engage in all those different opportunities. So sort of attuning yourself to oracy and deliberately teaching those skills to engage in those different contexts for talk that you might provide in the classroom. The fourth one is harnesses oracy to elevate learning. So this is about how you're using oracy as a tool to promote learning. So how you're creating opportunities for students to engage in what we call exploratory talk. So that comes from an academic called Douglas Barnes. So it's how you're getting students to engage in this really educationally productive talk that enables them to sort of test ideas, to expand and their knowledge, their understanding, to develop their thinking through talk, and how you do that as a teacher. And we can talk about some different ways that you might do that as well. And then the final one is appraises progress in oracy. So this is how you as the teacher are really sort of monitoring your students' progress in oracy, just like you would do that for writing, making sure that that you know where your students are at, what their strengths are, what they might need to work on in oracy, and also that you're providing students with feedback on their oracy, whether that's you as the teacher giving them that feedback, or whether you're creating opportunities for students to give feedback to each other on their oracy skills. So they're developing their sort of metacognitive understanding of oracy and talk, which will support them to, become better speakers and better listeners.
That sounds like a really useful set of benchmarks that I'm sure teachers can apply in their practice to reflect upon how well they're supporting children's oracy skills. I think there's a lot to unpack there. Firstly, I'd like to think about time and how teachers can have that space, given the busyness of their days, having to teach that content-specific knowledge, to really deliberately focus on teaching oracy skills. How might teachers do that in the classroom?
That's a question that we get asked a lot, and I think it's really difficult. We do have a very sort of packed curriculum, both in primary and secondary, so it's a challenge that's often brought to us. I think it's about the value of talk and really knowing and understanding the value of making the space for oracy within the classroom. And particularly when it comes to that fourth benchmark around harnessing oracy to elevate learning, it's about being really, really confident. As I said, there is the research, the evidence to back that up, that the time that you spend doing that is going to lead to better learning. So whilst you might need to take some extra time to kind of teach students the skills to engage in that really sort of educationally productive talk, once you've done that, I think it's a very sort of efficient method of learning. I think, if you're interested in how well students sort of retain knowledge, how they're able to apply their knowledge and understanding from one context into another, opportunities, well-structured, well-planned opportunities for students to engage in that talk for learning is a really efficient way of learning. So I think that's always a good reminder to give teachers when they bring that question. But yeah, you do have to sort of deliberately sort of make space and take time to do it, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. And within those benchmarks is a kind of real focus on inclusivity. I'm reflecting as you were speaking about that, about what oracy might look like in very multiliterate, multilingual schools compared to schools that are perhaps more monocultural or more monolingual. Within those different schools, what might teachers might need to look out for that might be different based on the cultural context they're working within?
I think for me, it's beginning with knowing kind of what you're asking students to do. So, for example, if you're engaging in exploratory talk or dialogic talk where you're getting students to really grapple with ideas through talk, to share sort of their initial thinking, partially formed ideas with each other, and how they sort of develop and extend those ideas. And we know that leads to really, really good learning. It's about making sure that your expectations are aligned with the context for talk, so the type that type of talk. So in those contexts, it's not about making sure that, you know, students are speaking in full sentences or speaking in standard English. Actually, you know, it is, you know, that they're not using fillers, for example. You know, when you're engaging in that exploratory talk for learning, it's completely natural to kind of speak in fillers. You might use your own like dialect, for example. Like it's not about speaking in one particular way within that context. So making sure that teachers really understand that and they don't almost hinder learning within that context by kind of focusing too much on how students are speaking, rather than actually kind of getting them speaking and getting them to engage in that talk for learning.
Yeah, there's lots of literature I've read on language policing, so it feels really important your definition of oracy isn't so restricted to that and really allows for all students, regardless of their linguistic backgrounds, to flourish and thrive.
I think that's really key. It's about how we're expanding, you know, students' repertoire of speaking, listening and communication skills. It's not about only developing one specific type of talk. It's you know, we really want this kind of expansive understanding, and you know, you're talking about language policing there. I think it's really important we don't have, you know, a kind of list of words that are banned within the classroom. It's not about banning language or banning words. It's about how we kind of expand students' repertoire rather than limit it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. You spoke about purposeful talk within your concept of kind of expansive talk, and I'm wondering what that looks like and how teachers can spot non-purposeful talk or perhaps non-productive talk. What might those differences be in a classroom context?
Yeah, I mean, hearing it played back from you there, it's interesting, that idea of kind of productive talk. And obviously, again, it depends what context you're talking. You know, if you're having a conversation with a friend, you know, it doesn't need to be sort of productive, does it? I don't want this kind of misconception that we only want students to engage in kind of very productive talk. But I guess if we go back to that sort of talk for learning and what kind of productive, you know, educationally productive talk looks like in that context, I think it's useful to go back to Douglas Barnes, who we mentioned in the last episode, and he looked at different types of talk within the classroom. So exploratory talk, which is that real sort of talk for learning, and then presentational talk, where you're kind of sharing your thinking, your knowledge, your understanding with others. And Neil Mercer, who's an academic who's done a lot of work on oracy, kind of built on and developed that concept of exploratory talk and looked at other types of talk that he'd seen in the classroom. So exploratory talk is that really educationally productive talk where students are developing their thinking, their understanding. Neil Mercer also identified cumulative talk. So sometimes that can sound quite good when students are engaging in it. They're kind of saying to each other like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and this, and this, and this, and this. And it kind of develops and builds, but there's not enough kind of challenge. Students aren't asking each other to kind of elaborate and develop each other's ideas. They're not probing. They're not challenging or clarifying what each other is saying. So it's not necessarily leading to that really great sort of learning that we want. And then sort of further down the spectrum of kind of non-productive talk within that context is what Neil Mercer talks about as disputational talk. So that's essentially when talk ends up in a bit of an argument. So there's lots of challenge, but kind of too much challenge, and perhaps not about the kind of the concepts and the ideas that are being spoken about. And often what we see in the classroom is that as teachers start to focus more on talk, they kind of move through, you know, when they first start doing more talk in their classroom, there might be some instances of that kind of disputational talk because students aren't used to engaging in that really educationally productive talk. They don't know how to do that. As they're taught how to do it, it might start to sound more kind of collegiate. There might be more of that kind of cumulative talk happening, which is great, but doesn't necessarily lead to that really great learning. And then finally, we'll get to that place where we're getting those really great examples of exploratory talk.
Yeah, that's fascinating what you're saying there about disputational talk. And I'm thinking about conflict in children's everyday lives with each other. I'm wondering what you would say to teachers there in terms of, do you really explicitly ask teachers to scaffold, you know, more fruitful discussions between the children, or do you perhaps put children in the way of finding the answers and let them figure it out for themselves? Is there a sense in which children need to overcome that conflict between themselves, or What's that tension? Do teachers do too much, or do we let children work it out for themselves?
I think it's a combination of both. I think you can definitely do too much. You can definitely over scaffold things to, discussion to within an inch of its life, and it doesn't have, students don't, the discussion doesn't have chance to breathe. And I think sometimes that's the temptation as a teacher, because you don't want it to go wrong. So you kind of give them loads and loads of sentence stems. They have 2 minutes to talk. That's all. And sometimes that's not that effective. So I think, it's that kind of Goldilocks thing, isn't it? Not too much, not too little. So one of the things that lots of our schools do is they have something called discussion guidelines. So what they'll do at the beginning of the year is they will set with their students a set of kind of guidelines for how to engage in that really sort of productive exploratory talk. And they'll develop those collaboratively with their students. So it might be that they have an example of, great group talk, really bad group talk, and they might get students to kind of pull out the differences between them and produce a set of kind of guidelines for really effective discussion. And then before, they set students off for discussion, they will remind students of those, and they might get them after the discussion, if things have gone wrong, perhaps to reflect on those. What did you do really well? Actually, it didn't go as well as you'd hoped today. What might you focus on more next time? So it's a kind of combination. It's getting students to understand what the archetype of really good talk in that context is, and then getting them able to kind of look at that, reflect on it, and then they'll make better choices next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that listeners will feel very comforted by the fact that there's some really good guidance available to them to be able to understand what strategies they can use to support their children in developing their oracy skills. And that's a really good place to end this episode. So thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you.
I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest Amy for joining us and providing us with such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Dr. Shaddai Tembo, and Amy Gaunt. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and to access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.